Hi, I'm Carly Putnam, Policy Director with Oklahoma Policy Institute. And on our webinar today, my policy team will be reviewing what the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, means for Oklahoma. This is an incredibly long piece of legislation, so we're just going to do really the highlights, but we hope you'll come out of it knowing more than you did when you went in. Next slide, please. This is the sort of table of contents of what we will go over today. I'll start by doing just a pretty basic overview of the bill and its background. Then we'll talk through what it means in terms of fiscal aid to states and governments, child well-being, criminal justice, healthcare, and then the advocacy opportunities that this act brings into Oklahoma. Next slide, please. ARPA was signed in March, and it's about 1.9 trillion in mandatory funding. And it builds on previous relief efforts, providing help for tens of millions of people who are still having difficulties paying their bills, and providing money to states and localities and territories and tribes to fill revenue holes, to address COVID-related needs, and to address learning needs for students. Some of these provisions are one-time investments like the stimulus payments, but others like the state and local aid allow for multiple years of investments. Overall, the bill is 1.9 trillion in mandatory funding, program changes, and tax policies aimed at mitigating the ongoing effects of the pandemic. There's $350 billion to help states, counties, cities, and tribal governments. The state and local governments can use the funds to cover costs incurred up until December of 2024. And then there's also, as I think is much better known, the stimulus payments, $1,400 for individuals, $2,800 for joint filers, and $1,400 for qualifying dependents. Dependents including full-time students younger than 24 and adult dependents as well. And they phase out for people with an adjusted gross income of $75,000 or more. Next slide, please. The Act provides unprecedented cash and near cash resources to families. The payments that we discussed earlier, the stimulus payments, but also the continuation of really important nutrition and housing policies. The Act provides significant investments in key areas such as housing and homelessness and childcare and education and health coverage. That's $123 billion to education that, if well used, could make a really significant difference in how we're approaching kids who have suffered learning loss. It provides significant resources to help states, localities, tribes, territories meet COVID challenges, and it takes seriously groups that have historically been left out of this aid. For instance, the cash going to tribes and territories. And a lot of that cash is pretty flexible in how it can be used. And so that's an enormous opportunity, but how we choose to spend those resources matters a lot in terms of how helpful they will be to Oklahomans. So to talk through the fiscal aid components of this, I'm going to turn this over to our policy analyst for budget and tax, Paul Shin.
Thanks, Carly. I'm going to talk about the general assistance to Oklahoma governments, and that is in addition to education aid and childcare and some of the other specifics that Carly talked about and that Gabrielle and Emma will be talking about later. For the general assistance, as much as $4 billion will be coming to Oklahoma's state and local and tribal governments from ARPA. That's almost 3 times the total that governments received in last year's CARES Act. It's around $1,000 per person living in our state, so it can make a real difference if we use it wisely. For state government alone, the funding is nearly $2.2 billion. And for cities and counties, it totals $1.3 billion. And that'll be divided amongst the cities and counties based on their population and their poverty levels. There's a separate national allocation for tribal funding. We don't know exactly how much of that will go to each tribe and how much will end up in Oklahoma. The rules for that are set by the Treasury Department. When can we see this money and when can we spend it? Uh, Governments could see the first of this money next month in May or maybe in June. All of the state, local, and tribal money has to be spent December 31st, 2024. So there'll be roughly 3.5 years to spend it all. What can we use that money for? Broadly, the law says respond to the COVID health and economic emergency. Then it goes on to give some specifics. It can be used for payments to individuals, small businesses, nonprofits, and affected industries. That gives state and local governments a lot of different options. And the bill goes on to give specific examples. And these aren't requirements, they're just examples. One is for premium pay to essential workers, and that can either be directly to workers or grants to their employers, can't exceed $13 an hour or $25,000 per worker per year. Now, this is really an important difference from last year's CARES money. It can be used to provide government services that are affected by state or local revenue shortfalls. So that means governments can maintain the services we need, even if they've lost local and state revenues from the pandemic. Wasn't an option in the CARES Act money. Then finally, the bill says that this money can be used for improving water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. The money specifically cannot be used for two things. One is to put it into pension funds. The other is to fund tax cuts with federal money. Broadly, if a state or local government has a net revenue loss from a tax cut, it can't use the federal money to fill in that tax cut. A lot of how we use this, we don't know. That will depend on upcoming guidance from the Treasury Department. Treasury has said it won't apply when state tax cuts happen automatically because ARPA changed federal tax law, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. The requirement also won't apply if some taxes are cut, but other taxes are increased, so there's no net loss of revenue. Now, ARPA doesn't prohibit tax reductions. It just says that for every dollar we reduce taxes, we have to hand the federal government $1 of ARPA money. This provision is in effect for tax reductions between March 21st, 2021, when the bill became law, and the last day of the fiscal year where the state or the local government spent all of its funds. That's probably going to be in 2025. Now, as far as who decides how the money will be used and when and how we can track that, we don't know. Federal law doesn't specify, and there's been little public discussion in Oklahoma, either at the state or local level, about who will make the spending decisions and what transparency and oversight requirements might be put in place. Let's go to the next slide. There's an additional small pot of money for state governments, some local governments, some tribal governments, that's from a capital projects fund. The states get this based on their share of total population, rural population, and low income population. Counties may get money in Oklahoma if they're determined to be the principal provider of public services in their jurisdiction. That would only happen probably for some very rural counties. How the tribal money will be distributed hasn't yet been determined. Now, this can be used for critical capital projects that enable work, education, and health monitoring in response to the coronavirus public health emergency. Treasury Department at the federal level needs to establish a grant application process for this within the first 60 days after the law passed. So that'll be sometime roughly next month. Now, Gabrielle Jacoby is going to talk about how ARPA will help children across Oklahoma.
Yes, so additional funding will be coming into Oklahoma to support the state's childcare industry and working parents of young children. For too long, high quality early education opportunities have been inaccessible for families across the state, in particular families of color, rural families, and low paid workers. Additionally, childcare providers have been operating on thin margins and have been trying to stay open during the COVID-19 pandemic to support working parents. ARPA will bring Oklahoma $363 million in childcare emergency stabilization funding to help childcare providers remain financially viable throughout the pandemic. This funding must be obligated by fiscal year 2022, and it can be used to reimburse any costs that were incurred prior to March 22nd, 2021 for things like personnel costs, PPE, COVID-related professional development, goods and services to maintain or resume childcare, and mental health supports for both employees and children. ARPA will also bring an additional $227 million to Oklahoma's child care development block grants to ensure that child care providers can safely operate during the pandemic, increase child care providers' pay and benefits, and reduce the cost of child care for families. It will also place no income limits on families who may receive assistance through these funds. These funds must be obligated by fiscal year 2023. And ARPA also allocates $1 billion for early Head Start and Head Start funding nationally. Next slide, please. Additional funding for Oklahoma schools will be critical in order for them to reopen safely and ensure that all students' educational needs are being met. ARPA will provide our state with $1.5 billion in new flexible funding for our school districts to spend over the next 3.5 years. This funding will be used to address learning loss and student trauma, reduce class sizes, modify spaces, modernize HVAC systems, and provide proper PPE to ensure schools can open safely. This can also be used to hire additional custodians, nurses, and school counselors. An additional $40 million will also become available to the state to support students with disabilities under IDEA. Next slide, please. Housing insecurity contributes to stress for both parents and children. Instability and frequent moving can disrupt a child's education and hinder their educational opportunities. ARPA contains several provisions that aim to reduce housing instability and mitigate any adverse effects these problems have on a child's health, development, and education. ARPA allocates $27.4 billion for rental assistance, $10 billion for homeowner assistance, $5 billion for Section 8 housing vouchers, $5 billion for homelessness assistance, $800 million under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act to provide wraparound services for students experiencing homelessness. It also provides $100 million in housing counseling that will target services to communities of color and neighborhoods with high concentration of low-income homeowners, renters, and people experiencing homelessness. So children who don't get enough food to eat can be at risk for worse academic, health, and economic outcomes. ARPA will extend and expand nutrition assistance programs to help families avoid food insecurity and put food on their tables. This will not only help with our children's immediate needs, but can also have long-lasting improvements in their health and educational outcomes. ARPA extends the 15% SNAP benefit increase through September 30th, 2021. It also allocates an additional $880 million in WIC funding, including 4 months of increased benefits. ARPA extends and expands the pandemic electronic benefits transfer through the summer and beyond to ensure that families have access to groceries in order to replace any meals a student might normally access through school. There's also additional funding that will be coming to Oklahoma to support all families and improve child well-being. The hardships caused by this pandemic harms not only individuals, but the potential of an entire generation in the state. The intense stress over the past year can interfere with parenting and negatively impact a child's physical and mental health. ARPA allocates $250 million for funding directly to communities to provide community-driven services to support and strengthen families. This funding should be used to create environments where families get the support they need, such as family resource centers, parenting programs, mental health and substance use services, and domestic violence services. It also provides $150 million for home visiting programs to ensure that families that are pregnant or families with young children have resources they need to promote their child's development. This funding can be used to improve the quality of virtual home visits, purchase needed technology for parents, as well as stipends for families to purchase groceries, diapers, formula, soap, etc. It also allocates $100 million for child protective services, as well as restores and expands the paid sick and family leave benefits that were passed last year. This will also reset the clock on March 31st, 2021, so that those who took leave in the past year are now eligible to take it again. So with that, I will hand it back over to Paul Shin.
So I'll talk for a couple of minutes about unemployment and about tax credits. And these are very important parts of the ARPA because they target a lot of federal money where it is needed most, to those with children and to those with low incomes. ARPA expands unemployment benefits through September 6th of this year and lengthens the amount of time that workers are eligible for them. There's two different pieces of unemployment. One is the pandemic emergency unemployment compensation. That's for workers who have exhausted their state benefits. And the length of time that they can get that benefit has been extended from 24 to 53 weeks under ARPA. The second piece is the pandemic unemployment assistance. And that's for people who lost their job due to the pandemic, but are ineligible for state benefits, maybe independent contractors, people in the gig economy. The time they can get that's been extended from 50 to 79 weeks. These are crucial investments, as middle and high wage unemployment in Oklahoma is down just 3% from the beginning of the pandemic. And low wage employment is down 13.9% as of mid-February. ARPA also exempts the first $10,200 received in unemployment benefits last year, 2020, from taxes for people with adjusted gross incomes under $150,000. Next slide, please. ARPA also expands two broad-based tax credits that are very important for families, particularly those with children. The first is the child tax credit. ARPA will expand that credit and make it fully refundable, but both of those are only for 1 year. Normally, the federal child tax credit is $2,000 per child. ARPA will increase that to $3,600 for each child under age 6 and $3,000 for older children. For the first time, this credit will be paid out in periodic installments, and so it will be available likely on a monthly basis starting in July. Now, Oklahoma also has a state child tax credit that is 5% of the federal one. So when the federal one goes up, the state child tax credit, or CTC, also goes up. And families will see an additional $50 per child state tax reduction for kids 6 and older, and $80 per child for children 5 and under. Now, a child tax credit that's expanded and refundable is going to help stabilize families and trigger a historic reduction in poverty, particularly for families of color and for children. Other important gains from expanding the child tax credit are better health and longevity for parents, especially for new moms, and better health for children. This credit can also lower government costs of protecting children from maltreatment. It can lower costs through reductions in crime and from reduced spending on children's and parents' health care costs. Increased child tax credit will also lead to higher future earnings for children, so it's a really important step in reducing intergenerational poverty. But that will only be really effective if this credit is made permanent. ARPA also expands the federal Earned Income Tax Credit, or EITC, for low-paid working adults who don't have children in the home. It raises the maximum income to get this credit from $16,000 per year to $21,000 per year, and it increases the maximum credit from around $530 to about $1,500. ARPA expands the range of eligible workers without children to include younger adults aged 19 to 24, as well as those with earned income who are over 65. So many more working people will be eligible for this credit. And just like the child tax credit, the federal EITC increase will trigger an increase in state earned income tax credit for childless workers as well. Oklahomans can claim a state EITC that's 5% of the federal credit. So childless workers will see a state EITC increase of up to $50. And those who didn't qualify before because they were not within the smaller age range or because they had a little bit over the maximum income will now qualify for the credit. And so they could see substantial increases. Next slide, please. This chart shows how many Oklahoma families and children will benefit from the expanded child tax credit. As many as 900,000 children. And it's well distributed. It will particularly help Oklahoma children of colors and their families. Now, Damian Shade is going to talk about how we can use the resources that ARPA provides to help advance criminal justice reform in Oklahoma.
Thank you, Paul. So the American Rescue Plan offers some remarkable opportunities to invest in front-end crime prevention and treatment services and resources that would both help victims and those who have experienced issues around crime and those sorts of behaviors, and that would strengthen the criminal justice system writ large. So the American Rescue Plan allocates about $3.5 billion for block grants, addressing behavioral health disorders, several million more for other behavioral health programs and workforce issues that, if properly calibrated, could target some of the significant gaps that we see in access to care, especially in rural Oklahoma. These gaps in treatment, as we know, are particularly pernicious amongst those people who are experiencing homelessness, those people who are at the lower elements of the income spectrum, and those individuals who are furthest from treatment and care. Again, often in rural communities and highly dense urban communities of color, where we see access to care really particularly broken. The bulk of this money goes to mental health and substance use block grants, which would be administered by mental health providers, community-based care for Oklahomans struggling with addiction. That is another $1.5 billion specifically for substance use disorder block grants. And as we know, every time a community mental health center is built somewhere in a county, we see the cost of crime decrease on average by about $4.2 million. And so these front investments are some of the best levers that we have to both reduce crime and to reduce the footprint of our carceral system across the state. Go ahead to the next slide. These investments are particularly significant in Oklahoma because we see that the American Rescue Plan offers the opportunity for state and local governments to use some of the significant fiscal relief that will be coming to both counties and cities across the state and the state government to give to nonprofits in the form of grant programs, public benefit corporations, and other special government purpose units, things like paying bail for certain eligible individuals, especially in misdemeanor appearances, where we see in county jails across the state of Oklahoma, there's been a significant uptick in the amount of people who have been on misdemeanor dockets. And as trials have begun following the pandemic, we are going to see an increase, an influx of those individuals into the system. Paying fines and fees for eligible individuals. We see that one of the biggest barriers that people with justice involvement in the state of Oklahoma routinely face is their ability to live a normal life when saddled with the massive debt that courts impose. This creates problems for people getting a job. This creates problems with people being able to keep their driver's license to be able to drop their kids off to school and go to work. And this creates significant barriers for people to be able to even meet the duties and assignments of their probation or their parole requirements or supervision requirements. People who can't drive, people who are saddled with more debt than they can pay, are not individuals who are able to keep up with the requirements that courts have for them. There's also an opportunity to invest in career development for justice-involved individuals. We know that the unemployment rate of the justice involved in Oklahoma is 5 times higher than that of the state average. And so this is occupational licensing fees, vocational training, and front-end economic barriers that particularly hit that population of the lowest income Oklahomans with justice involvement. There's also $5 billion to assist people experiencing homelessness with immediate and long-term assistance. Those funds will remain available until September 20th, 2030. The first 40% of that funding for the Emergency Rental Assistance Program will be provided within 60 days of enactment. So we expect, likely by late May or early June, some tranches of funding to begin moving to state and local entities. There is a lot of space here for real front-end investment that can change lives. And in Oklahoma, as these next slides will show you, that is a particularly necessary step. So as this slide makes clear, this open justice graph shows the median jail stay for nonviolent offenders detained pretrial in 11 of the most populous counties in our state. And as you can see, that median jail stay for those people who couldn't pay their bail or didn't pay their bail was longer than 6 months for several counties. We have a significant pretrial detention problem in the state, as many people may have seen in Oklahoma County with recent deaths and some of the significant issues that have been in the news there. One of the largest problems we have, both during this pandemic and after, is the public health crisis that happens in these spaces when they're overcrowded, and the profound downstream effects that happen to communities when people are kept in jail simply because they cannot buy their freedom back from a bondsman. As this next graph is going to show you, we see a similar economic problem with court fines and fees. This open justice graph analyzes the fines and fees data from 13 Oklahoma counties and shows you the average amount of fines and fees for defendants. As we are learning more of the issues in rural Oklahoma particularly, we are seeing a higher per capita fine and fee debt load amongst those rural Oklahomans than we even see in urban communities. In urban communities, we are seeing a larger quantity of debt, but most of that debt is being particularly focused on Black and brown communities. In communities like Tulsa, Oklahoma, where I live, the poorest Black neighborhoods with these large amounts of debt see police stops at more than 100 times the rate of white Oklahomans. And so we see this linchpin connection between these two pieces and factors of public policy, where these failure to pay warrants and this court debt is a target on communities of color and low-income communities in rural Oklahoma. The American Rescue Plan offers us a remarkable opportunity to begin to chip away at some of this economic injustice. Move on to the next slide. As this slide shows, there are also pretty significant system supports that could be added to the entire process of the Oklahoma justice system, both the court process and the incarceral system, to make some significant changes here. So we see about $1.8 billion appropriation to the Department of Health and Human Services to fund COVID mitigation strategies to some of our most vulnerable populations in what they call congregate settings. This includes jails and prisons, as well as nursing homes and other locations. These funds should be focused on strategies that reduce jail and prison populations. I mentioned the Oklahoma County Jail because it is a space that's been in the news a lot lately. And one of the largest problems with that jail, beyond the infrastructure issues and policy issues, is it is a space that 1,600 people are living in right now. And it was not designed for nearly that burden on the plumbing infrastructure. The infrastructure of the building cannot support that. And we are still in the midst of a global pandemic where we know it's only about 1 in 4 Oklahomans that have actually been vaccinated at this point. And so that population of individuals in our jails and prisons, those are also people who are extremely unlikely to have had vaccine access at this point. And so strategies like purchasing GPS technology to improve supervised release, increasing administrative agency funding to facilitate higher rates of commutation, and medical parole for vulnerable inmates. We have seen the commutation rate increase in the Oklahoma Department of Corrections, those people who are being commuted by the Pardon and Parole Board. But we've seen a significant decrease in the regular parole system over the past year. And a large reason for that is because the Pardon and Parole Board needs more staffing support to manage those caseloads and to deal with the parole dockets that they're seeing in the larger amount. The American Rescue Plan offers us an easy opportunity to boost the pay and to bring in some resources, better technology resources and better action resources to make the Pardon and Parole's job work a little more efficiently. Then there is another $1 billion in the American Rescue Plan for the Technology Modernization Fund. There is no piece of the Oklahoma criminal justice system that deserves more immediate infrastructural attention than the data or the lack of data that we see in our system. So we need a system that centralizes and integrates the information that we get from courts, the information that we get from jails and prisons and from law enforcement into one place. We need a system that would be able to allow our law enforcement and our lawmakers to have racial impact statements, to understand the racial impact of various legislation that's moving forward that will impact our prison beds and the prison population in our state. And right now, OSBI, one of the law enforcement entities that's responsible for tracking that data, says Oklahoma does not have the data capacity to do racial or community impact statements, which is a very distressing fact when you learn that the state of Iowa, a state that is not known for its data proclivities, started doing racial impact statements around 2007. So it is important for Oklahoma to see all of the investments that we make here create an integrated system that's streamlined and functions better. And the last piece of this is we could simplify our expungement process with some of these front-end technological investments, and we could create an opportunity for things like the Clean Slate Initiative and automatic expungement protocols, which we've seen passed recently in states like Michigan, states like Utah, where these low-end offenses where people have paid their debt to society and they simply want to move on with their lives and have better access to jobs and better access to all of the opportunities that we are able to access when we don't have justice involvement. We have the money on a front-end basis through this American Rescue Plan to make investments that could fundamentally change this system. I'm going to pass this on to Emma Morris, who's going to talk about the profound opportunities relative to the American Rescue Plan and Medicaid.
Awesome, thank you, Damian. So the ARPA also provides enhanced funding for Medicaid expansion and several other vital health initiatives. Typically, the federal government pays about $2 for every dollar that the state spends on Medicaid, but the ARPA increases the federal government's share by providing a 5 percentage point increase in the base non-expansion FMAP for the first 2 years of Medicaid expansion. So unlike some of the other investments that we discussed, this money will come as a reimbursement directly to the OHCA. And this is projected to generate at least or more than $500 million for Oklahoma in just 2 years. It will easily cover the state's share of the first 2 years of expansion, and it will make the program in the long term more affordable as we see increased tax revenue and state budget savings. This is a significant investment that doesn't actually require any funding from the state. The bill also temporarily provides an easy pathway for states to expand postpartum Medicaid coverage from 60 days to 1 year. Oklahoma's maternal mortality rate is one of the worst in the nation, with a disproportionate impact on Black women. So this option, when it becomes available in April of 2022, will provide a way for Oklahoma to begin addressing that crisis. The bill also provides a temporary 10 percentage point increase to the FMAP specifically for the Home and Community-Based Services Program. This increase is available for 1 year, so it will end next March, and it has to be used to supplement existing state funding and to strengthen the program. This will help older Oklahomans and those with disabilities be able to receive care that they need in their homes and their communities rather than in institutional settings. And finally, the ARPA fully funds urban Indian health organizations for the next 2 years. This is a good first step, but decades of underfunding mean that we still have a long way to go on fully funding those organizations. Next slide, please. This graph shows a little bit about the expansion funding that I discussed. As you'll see, the increased ARPA funds will cover the cost of Medicaid expansion for the first 2 years. And we estimate that in the second year, the state will begin to see those increased tax revenues and savings to state agencies, like the Department of Mental Health and the Department of Corrections. And those will be a direct result of Medicaid expansion. So when the ARPA funding ends, the increased revenue will considerably lower the state's share of expansion, and that share will decrease each year until the program begins to pay for itself. Next slide. So lastly, the ARPA also makes health coverage more affordable for individual Oklahomans. So first, we have the marketplace. Many individuals who purchase health insurance through the federal marketplace are eligible for advanced premium tax credits, or APTCs, that offset their monthly premium costs. Despite this premium assistance, before the ARPA was passed, the marketplace was still inaccessible for a lot of people. But the ARPA begins to fix this problem by eliminating premiums for people that make less than 150% of the federal poverty level, which is about $19,300 for an individual. And it caps premiums at 8.5% of income for all enrollees, including higher income individuals. So these actions are going to make the marketplace more affordable across the board for people who aren't able to get health insurance through their employer. Additionally, anyone who receives jobless benefits at any time during 2021 will become automatically eligible for premium-free health insurance through the federal marketplace. And finally, the ARPA makes COBRA coverage more accessible. So COBRA is what becomes available to someone after a layoff, but it's often too expensive to be a reality because the employee has to pay 100% of the cost rather than splitting the cost with their employer. But through September of this year, the federal government will pay 100% of those premium costs for people that maintain their insurance through COBRA. As always, there are other eligibility factors that may impact these options, and anyone who is looking for health coverage should explore all the options to find the best fit. So now I will turn it back over to Carly to talk about opportunities for advocates to get involved.
Thanks, Emma. So as we've presented here over the last hour, there are a lot of opportunities available and a lot of ways that this money can be directed. And so there's a lot of opportunities for you to share what you think ought to be done with it. Regardless of whether we're talking about state or federal, I think it's really important to note that by and large, over the last year, COVID didn't actually break many systems. It just exposed where a lot of the breaks already were. And ARPA has done a lot and will do a lot to help mend some of those breaks, but we need to make that system stronger overall. So on the federal level, we would encourage folks to advocate for the permanent expansion of the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit. They have been too small for too long, and we know that families really need that support, and that support then goes out to their communities. Similarly, we'd encourage folks to advocate for the expansion of tax credits and services to families regardless of their immigration status. Their kids go to school with our kids, they shop in our stores, we live in our neighborhoods, and the rising tide lifts all boats. We need people to have access to the services and funds that they need. The state level has, as we've seen, a fair amount of flexibility. So it's really important that you're letting your legislators know what your priorities are, and also letting them know very kindly that you're watching and holding them accountable. We know from the Legislative Office of Fiscal Transparency report earlier this year that there's still some pretty significant question marks about where earlier rounds of relief funding have been spent. And it's really important that there's accountability being built in by the voting public. But regardless of how you're affected by this and which specific priorities you care about, it's really important that you are telling your stories. If these temporary changes to tax credits or childcare or school services or healthcare or the criminal justice system are making a difference for you or for your community and the people that you care about, lawmakers need to be hearing from you, because that is the most effective way for us to try to make these changes permanent and create a stronger system for all of us. Next slide, please. That wraps up our webinar. Thank you hugely to the OK Policy staff who have been part of this. Thanks to Paul and Gabrielle and Damien and Emma, also to Josie and Ashley for helping with putting this together behind the scenes. The comms team and other OK Policy staff, thanks to you for sitting through a fairly long, weedy hour. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can find us at info@okpolicy.org and on all of the socials. Thank you so much.